Most people think of poker as a game of luck and quick wins. But there is a quiet side to it. A place where the real strength comes from steady hands and clear decisions. The surface is noisy and uncertain, but underneath, there is a way to move through every hand with calm and purpose. Here, the focus is not on chasing big pots or dramatic moments. Instead, it is about building a system you can trust. You learn how to define your own measure of success. You see how careful game selection and bankroll choices can make every decision easier. Step by step, the basics of preflop and postflop play become habits you can rely on. Each part of the game, from c-betting to river decisions, is broken down into clear, workable pieces. Mental calm and a steady process start to matter more than any single outcome. The pressure comes from time itself. It is the slow wait of days and weeks, where real progress is measured by consistency, not by a single night's result. There is no need to rush. The pace will stay even and gentle. Nothing will change suddenly. You can settle in and let your mind move as slowly as it needs. The table is quiet. The cards come one at a time. There is space here to breathe and to think, without hurry. Chapter 1. Defining your win condition as consistency. When you judge yourself by one session, or even a handful of sessions, your focus shifts to immediate outcomes, those quick wins or losses that feel so important in the moment. But if you start thinking in terms of months and years, you'll find your attention moving toward the quality and consistency of your process instead. A single cash game session, even for a professional, might only last a few hours. In that short stretch, you could play well and lose, or play poorly and win, just because the cards fell a certain way. For online no-limit Texas Hold'em cash games at the lower stakes, strong players might win around 60 to 70% of their sessions, but that means even the best lose a fair chunk of the time. In live games, the pace is slower, and the skill gap might be wider, so the session win rate can be a bit higher, but the principle stays the same. A single night's result is not a clear reflection of your skill. If you only look at your results after one or two sessions, it's easy to feel like you're doing everything right, or everything wrong, depending on which side of variance you land. But a month of play brings together dozens of sessions, sometimes hundreds of hours, and thousands of hands. Over that kind of stretch, the noise starts to fall away. You might still have swings, sometimes even big ones, but the overall direction of your results will start to match the quality of your decisions much more closely. That's why strong players rarely judge themselves by what happened tonight or this weekend. They're looking at their ability to execute well over the long haul. They know that even players who barely break even in the long run can have a slightly better than 50% session win rate for stretches, just from the natural ups and downs of the game. By focusing on months instead of sessions, you'll find it easier to avoid the emotional roller coaster that comes with short-term swings, and you'll start to build the kind of discipline that leads to real improvement. Short-term feedback in poker is tricky. The game is full of situations where you'll make the right move and lose, or make the wrong move and win. That's variance, sometimes called luck, but really it's just the difference between what happens once and what happens if you repeat something many times. In poker, the idea of expected value, or EV, is the average result you'd get from a decision if you could play it out again and again. But in the moment, you only see one outcome. Because live no-limit Texas Hold'em cash games move slowly, you might only see a few dozen meaningful hands in a single session. That makes it really easy for variance to cloud your judgment. You can run into a stretch where you win almost every time you play, or you can go through a cold streak that lasts for weeks, even if you're making strong decisions. Simulations show that winning streaks can happen about 20% of the time in high volatility games. But as you play more and more, those streaks even out, and the real edge, good or bad, shows itself. That's why it's so dangerous to trust your gut about how you're doing based on a few recent sessions. If you rely on that short-term feedback, you might start changing your approach for the wrong reasons. Maybe you tighten up after a losing streak, or get reckless after a heater. Over time, those reactions can pull you away from what actually works. Instead, the most reliable feedback comes from reviewing your process, looking at your hands, your decisions, and your habits over time, not just what happened last night. This is where consistency really starts to matter. You can't control the cards that come or the way the board runs out, but you can control the quality of your decisions and the habits you build around the game. Table selection is one of the most powerful tools you have in no-limit Texas Hold'em cash games. When you choose games with weaker opponents, you make it much easier to find profitable spots, session after session. That's something you can do every time you sit down, and over the course of many months, it makes a huge difference. The hands you choose to play before the flop, your starting hand ranges, are another big piece of the puzzle. Tighter, more disciplined ranges tend to stabilize your results over the long term, helping you avoid marginal spots that can swing wildly from session to session. Bet sizing is just as important. The way you size your bets shapes the pot and affects how your opponents respond. Thoughtful, consistent sizing makes your decisions harder to exploit and keeps you from leaking money in spots where it's easy to make mistakes. Mindset is a quieter, but no less important part of the equation. Professionals know that their focus and mental energy are limited, so they manage their playing hours to stay sharp and avoid burnout. That means taking breaks, choosing the right times to play, and making sure you're not sitting down when you're tired or distracted. Over a month or a year, that kind of discipline adds up to much better decisions and far fewer costly errors. Regular review habits tie everything together. After each session, it helps to go back through your hands and look for patterns. Maybe you notice you're losing more than you thought in certain spots, or maybe you find a leak in your preflop strategy. Professionals often track thousands of hands each month, using that data to refine their approach to ranges, sizing, and table selection. Over time, this habit of honest review is what lets you spot trends and make real improvements, even when the short-term results are noisy or discouraging. When you start seeing your own progress through the lens of months and years, you'll notice the game slows down a bit. The pressure to win right now fades, and you can focus on the things you actually control. You'll find that even the inevitable losing sessions feel less painful, because you know they're just a small piece of a much bigger picture. What matters most isn't what happened today, but how you're building the habits and making the decisions that'll pay off over the long run. Let yourself settle into that bigger perspective. Watch how your discipline and your process shape your experience at the table. Over time, you'll find that consistency becomes your real win condition, the thing that keeps you steady, keeps you improving, and keeps you in the game for as long as you want to be there. Chapter 2: Bankroll and Game Selection as a Skill Multiplier. The size of your bankroll shapes what you can risk, and the games you sit in determine how often your skill really matters. Without these fundamentals in place, even strong technical play can get lost to swings or tough opponents. There's a wide range of bankroll philosophies out there. Some players stick to a conservative approach, keeping 40 or 50 or even more buy-ins for their chosen stakes. Others lean aggressive, sometimes playing with around 20 or 30 buy-ins, especially if they've got experience and a high tolerance for swings. Each style changes your relationship with risk. With a conservative approach, you'll usually feel steadier session to session. A big stack of buy-ins helps absorb downswings, so you're less likely to get rattled by a string of bad results. That calm lets you focus on making good decisions, not just surviving. When you're playing for a small fraction of your total bankroll, you can fold, bluff, or value bet without worrying that one bad hand will end your run. Aggressive bankroll management can get you into bigger games sooner, but it comes with more stress and a higher risk of going broke. When you're under-rolled, every downswing feels sharper. You might start second-guessing value bets or passing up thin bluffs because losing stings more. Even strong players can slip into cautious or erratic play when the bankroll shrinks faster than expected. The emotional side of poker gets louder when you're risking a bigger piece of your safety net. Loose, aggressive strategies in cash games also make swings larger, so players using those styles often need even more buy-ins to avoid ruin. If you're playing a tighter style, you might feel comfortable with a slightly smaller bankroll, but the trade-off is less flexibility when games get wild. How you pick your bankroll plan depends on your goals and your life outside the game. If you're playing for fun and don't mind reloading, you might accept more risk. If poker's a key part of your income, or you just hate the feeling of big losses, a conservative plan keeps your stress lower. There's no universal answer. The main thing is knowing which approach lets you play your A game consistently, not just when things are going well. Once you've got your bankroll philosophy set, you'll still face decisions about moving up or down in stakes. The process is always emotional, but having clear rules makes it a lot easier to stay disciplined. Let's talk through how you can handle these transitions without letting swings push you into mistakes. If your bankroll grows past the threshold you set, that's when you can consider moving up. A common rule is waiting until you've got enough buy-ins for the next level, maybe 40 or 50 if you're conservative, or a bit less if you're comfortable with risk. When you take a shot at higher stakes, set a firm stop-loss for the session. That means you decide ahead of time how much you're willing to lose before dropping back down. If you hit that limit, you move down without debate. This keeps one bad session from wiping out weeks of steady progress. Moving down in stakes isn't a defeat. It's a safety mechanism. When your bankroll falls below your comfort zone for a particular game, dropping down lets you rebuild without risking ruin. The best players do this without hesitation. They know that protecting their bankroll is what keeps them in the game for the long haul. Setting clear session boundaries helps here too. Before you start, decide how much you're willing to lose or win before calling it a day. These boundaries aren't there to lock in short-term results. They just protect you from chasing losses or getting reckless after a big win. When you stick to them, you'll find it easier to stay detached from each session's outcome. Over time, this habit builds real consistency. Taking shots at higher stakes can be exciting, but it's only a good idea if you've got a clear plan for when to pull back. Some players use a milestone system, moving up only after building a cushion of extra buy-ins. Others might take a shot when the games look especially good, but always with a stop-loss in place. The important part is being systematic, not impulsive. That way, you avoid letting a hot streak or a rough patch dictate your limits. Now let's talk about how the games you choose and where you sit at the table can multiply the value of your technical skills. Even the best strategy won't shine in the wrong environment. Table and seat selection are the quiet skills that separate grinders from those who just tread water. The first thing to look for is player density. That means finding tables with plenty of weaker, recreational players. These opponents make more fundamental mistakes and give you more chances to earn value. When you're surrounded by tough regulars, your edge shrinks and variance goes up. So scanning the room or the list of available tables for those softer spots is always worth the time. Stack depth is another factor that changes how you can play. Deeper stacks let you apply more pressure after the flop, opening up advanced lines and bigger pots. Skilled players can use this leverage to extract more value from mistakes, or to push opponents off hands they'd otherwise play to showdown. If you're comfortable playing deep, seek out tables where most players have full stacks. Shallow tables limit your options and reduce your edge. Where you sit at the table matters too. Positional leverage means putting yourself in spots where you'll act after the weaker players as much as possible. This lets you see how they act before you make a decision, which makes every hand easier to navigate. Try to avoid having tough regulars directly on your left, since they'll act after you and can make your life difficult. If you notice a particularly weak player at the table, try to get a seat directly to their left, so you act after them on every hand. Over time, these small edges add up. Developing habits around table and seat selection is as important as working on your hand reading or bet sizing. Scan the tables before you sit down. Watch a few orbits if you're not sure who's who. Change seats if the table gets tougher, or the weak players leave. These adjustments can turn an average session into a profitable one, or help you avoid slow losses in tougher lineups. All these off-table skills, bankroll management, moving between stakes, and sharp game selection, act as multipliers for the technical work you put in. They don't replace the need for solid play, but they make sure your skills actually pay off over time, instead of getting eaten up by variance or bad environments. Mastering these basics isn't just about surviving. It's about building a foundation where your decisions matter, session after session, month after month. When you've got your bankroll secure and your table selection sharp, every hand you play carries more weight. That's when poker really starts to reward the work you put in, and where consistency becomes your real edge. Chapter 3: Preflop Foundations. You can execute reliably. Where you sit at the table changes the pressure on your opening choices and makes position-based discipline the single most important habit for preflop reliability. If you act early, you'll have to deal with more opponents after the flop, so you need to stick to hands that can handle that pressure. When you're in later position, you'll have fewer players left to act, and that's when you can start adding more speculative hands to your range without inviting as much trouble. There are 1,326 unique two-card starting hand combinations in Texas Hold'em. Out of those, only 6 combinations make up any specific pocket pair, like pocket aces. That means most hands you get dealt won't be especially strong, and it's your job to sort the playable ones from the rest. In early position, you'll want to focus on hands that consistently perform well against multiple opponents. If you start opening weaker hands just to see more flops, you're setting yourself up for tough spots later on, and that's how small mistakes start to add up. Marginal opens might seem harmless at first, but over time they bleed chips in subtle ways. Every time you open a hand that's not quite strong enough from early or middle position, you're inviting more callers or 3-bets, and you'll find yourself playing larger pots out of position with hands that struggle to make strong pairs or draws. The result is a steady drain that's hard to notice, session by session, but shows up clearly in the long run. It's not about avoiding action entirely. It's about making sure the hands you play from each seat give you the best shot at a profitable outcome. As you move toward the button, you can widen your range and include more hands that have the potential to make straights or flushes. That's because you'll be last to act after the flop, which gives you an edge in information and lets you control the pace of the hand. Even so, you want to keep your approach structured. If you start opening too many hands too often, it gets harder to keep track of your ranges, and mistakes start to multiply. Consistency in your opening discipline is what keeps you out of trouble and helps you recognize when your leaks are costing you. Limping into unopened pots, meaning just calling the big blind instead of raising, tends to invite more players into the hand and puts you at a disadvantage right away. Standard preflop raises are usually about 3 to 4 times the big blind, and sticking with that sizing signals strength while discouraging loose calls. The goal is to keep your preflop approach aggressive and controlled, so you're building pots with strong hands and keeping the number of opponents manageable. Once you've got your opening ranges under control, you'll want to think about how to respond when someone else raises before you. That's where 3-betting comes in, and it's a key part of shaping the preflop landscape. A 3-bet is simply a re-raise after an initial raise, and using it well lets you put pressure on your opponents, build bigger pots with your best hands, and take control of the betting. There are 2 main ways to build your 3-bet range: linear and polarized. A linear 3-bet range is all about strength from the top down. You start with your strongest hands and move straight down the list to a certain cutoff point. This makes sense when you're facing a raise from an early position, or when you're in the blinds, where you want to avoid getting caught with weak holdings. A polarized 3-bet range, on the other hand, mixes your best hands with a few bluffs, hands that aren't quite good enough to call, but might force folds if you apply the right pressure. You'll usually see this approach in later positions or against frequent openers who might be raising with a lot of weak hands themselves. Choosing between linear and polarized depends on where you're sitting and who you're up against. If you 3-bet only your best hands, you become predictable, and sharp opponents will stop giving you action. If you go too loose, you'll run into trouble when called or re-raised. The trick is to keep your 3-bet range balanced, so your opponents can't easily tell whether you have a monster or a well-timed bluff. 3-bet sizing matters too. In position, 3-bets are usually about 3 to 3.5 times the original raise. Out of position, you'll want to make it a bit bigger to compensate for the disadvantage of acting first after the flop. That extra size makes it tougher for your opponent to call with speculative hands, and keeps you in control of the pot. As you get more comfortable, you'll start to notice patterns in how different players 3-bet. If someone's 3-betting a lot, their range is likely polarized, and you can adjust accordingly. If they rarely 3-bet, you can assume they're sticking to a linear, value-heavy approach. Once the action gets to you in the blinds, things get trickier. The big blind and small blind are unique spots because you've already put money in the pot, but you'll be out of position for the rest of the hand. The small blind gives you the best price to call, but it's the worst seat post-flop. Defending your blinds is about finding the right balance between calling with hands that perform well and mixing in enough 3-bets to avoid being predictable. When you're defending the big blind, you'll want to call with hands that can flop strong pairs, draws, or have good playability, especially against late position opens. You should also throw in some 3-bets with strong hands and a few well-chosen bluff candidates, so your opponents can't just steal your blind every time. The chance of being dealt any pocket pair is about 5.9%, so you'll need to rely on more than just pairs when you're defending. If you're facing a 3-bet yourself, it's time to consider 4-bet thresholds. That just means knowing which hands are strong enough to re-raise again, either for value or as a calculated bluff. Premium hands like pocket aces or pocket kings are always in that group, but you can also include some suited connectors or ace blocker hands as occasional bluffs, especially if your opponent is 3-betting a lot. 4-bet sizing in position is usually around 2.25 to 2.5 times the 3-bet size, which keeps the pot manageable and gives your opponent tough decisions. Consistency in your raise sizes is critical. If you start changing your sizing based on hand strength, observant players will pick up on it and exploit your tendencies. Keeping your 3-bets and 4-bets within standard ranges makes your play harder to read and forces your opponents to play more honestly. Over time, this discipline helps you control pot sizes and keeps your post-flop spots simpler, especially when you're out of position. Reliable pre-flop decisions take a lot of the guesswork out of poker. When you stick to disciplined opening ranges, balanced 3-bet strategies, and consistent sizing, you'll find that your post-flop choices become much easier. You'll be in more manageable spots with stronger hands, and you'll avoid the trap of chasing action with hands that just aren't worth it in the long run. Building these habits is what sets the foundation for steady improvement. You're not aiming for perfection in every hand, but for a process you can trust and repeat. Over months and years, that's what keeps your results steady and your confidence growing, even as the games change around you. Let your pre-flop discipline do the heavy lifting, and you'll have a solid base to build the rest of your game. Take your time, trust your process, and give yourself the space to make good decisions, one hand at a time. Chapter 4: Post-flop, Thinking Through Range versus Range. Some post-flop boards create more opportunities for players to apply pressure, while others naturally slow the action down. This difference comes mostly from how the community cards connect with the ranges each player brought to the flop. In No Limit Texas Hold'em, we call this board texture. Board texture means the shape of the flop, like whether it comes out disconnected and rainbow, or paired, or connected and suited. Each of those textures changes how likely it is that strong hands or draws are present. When you see a dry board, such as a high-card unpaired flop with 3 different suits, there are very few draws available. Most of the time, these textures interact best with the pre-flop raiser's range. That means the player who raised before the flop will have more of the strong high cards that connect with these boards. Because of that, the pre-flop aggressor can often bet more frequently, applying pressure with a wider selection of hands. It is simply harder for the caller to have hit anything strong on these flops. If the board comes out wet, like 3 cards all in a row, or 2 of the same suit, things shift. Wet boards contain more potential draws for both players. The probability of making a flush by the river, if you start with 2 suited cards, is only about 3%. Straights are not much more common, showing up just over 4% of the time by the river in 7-card poker. Still, when the flop offers these possibilities, both players need to respect that strong hands and big draws are possible. On wet textures, the pre-flop aggressor usually slows down. The player who called pre-flop is more likely to have hands that connect with these coordinated boards. Aggression drops, and both sides tend to play a little more cautiously. Some boards fall in between. A 2-tone disconnected flop offers a flush draw, but not many straight draws. Sometimes you'll see paired boards, which reduce the chance of big draws, but open up the potential for trips or full houses. Every board texture gives clues about which player's range is favored, and which hands are more likely to be present. The real value in understanding board texture is that it lets you adjust your post-flop strategy with purpose. When you recognize a dry ace-high or king-high flop, you'll know these boards usually favor the pre-flop raiser. You can bet more often, knowing your range contains more of the strong hands. But when you see a connected or suited flop, you'll realize more caution is needed, since the caller can have more hands that hit these textures. Good players do not memorize every possible board. Instead, they learn to spot the broad types and adjust their aggression or defense accordingly. This keeps post-flop play consistent and avoids unnecessary complexity. On any flop, you'll want to consider not just your own hand, but how your entire range interacts with the board compared to your opponent's range. This brings us to the idea of range advantage and nut advantage. Both are crucial for post-flop thinking. Range advantage means that one player's collection of possible hands, based on their actions so far, fits the board better overall. For example, on a dry king-high board, the preflop raiser has a range full of strong kings, big pairs, and high cards. The caller, who did not re-raise, is less likely to have those holdings. So the raiser has range advantage. Even if neither player has a really strong hand at the moment, the raiser's range as a whole is stronger. Nut advantage is a little different. This is about which player can make the absolute best possible hand on this board. Sometimes, both players can have the nuts. Other times, only one player realistically can. On a very wet board, like a flop with 3 connected cards or 2 suited cards, the caller often has more combinations of the strongest possible hands and draws. That means the caller has nut advantage, even if the preflop raiser's range is stronger on average. The difference between these two advantages changes how you want to play. When you have range advantage, you can bet more frequently and with smaller sizes, putting pressure on your opponent's weaker range. When the board gives your opponent nut advantage, you'll want to bet less often, but sometimes use bigger sizes to represent strength or to protect your own strong hands. On dry boards, range advantage matters more, and the preflop raiser usually leads. On wet, coordinated boards, nut advantage has more influence, and the preflop caller can apply pressure with big draws and strong hands. Thinking in terms of ranges, rather than just the 2 cards in front of you, helps you decide when to bet, how much to bet, and when to slow down. It keeps your strategy balanced and makes you tougher to play against. Instead of guessing whether your exact hand is good, you're evaluating how your whole range compares to your opponent's range on this particular board. It's not enough to simply react to each card as it comes. Strong players form a plan for the hand as soon as the flop is dealt. They use preflop context, position, action, and board texture to map out likely turn and river scenarios. If the flop is dry and favors their range, they might plan to bet the flop and possibly the turn, keeping up the pressure across multiple streets. On a wet board, they might check the flop, planning to call or fold depending on the next card. Planning ahead means thinking about which cards could change the balance of power. A 3rd suited card on the turn may turn your top pair into a bluff catcher. A connecting card might complete a straight or create new draws. The probability of making 2 pair by the river is about 23% in 7-card poker, so you'll want to think about how often those hands can show up in each range. When you plan your hand early, you're less likely to get lost or confused if the board changes. You'll already have an idea of which cards are good or bad for your range, and you'll know how to adjust your aggression or defense. You'll also avoid the common trap of making isolated decisions on each street, which can lead to inconsistent and unbalanced play. Instead, you'll be executing a process that helps you stay disciplined and focused on the long term. Disciplined post-flop thinking is not about memorizing every possible combination. It's about building a habit of comparing ranges and board textures, then forming a plan that guides you through the hand. Over time, this approach will help you make better decisions, avoid costly mistakes, and keep your strategy sharp no matter who sits across the table. As you slow down and consider how ranges interact from the flop onward, you'll notice your post-flop game becoming much steadier and more predictable in a good way. Each decision becomes part of a bigger plan, not just a reaction to the latest card. That is how you build real consistency in cash gameplay and start thinking like a true strategist. Chapter 5. C-Betting with Purpose. Your betting decisions after the flop change dramatically when you stop thinking about your own hand and start thinking about ranges, you'll see right away that every continuation bet you make needs a reason that fits the situation. If you just fire bets on autopilot, you're not really playing poker. You're just pressing buttons and hoping for the best. Let's talk about how to slow down and run that purpose test before you put chips in the middle. There are three main reasons players choose to make a continuation bet. Sometimes you want value from worse hands. Other times you're looking to protect against hands that could improve on later streets. Then there are spots where you're bluffing, trying to make your opponent fold a better hand or deny them the chance to draw out. When you're thinking about betting, you've got to ask yourself which of those goals you're actually trying to achieve. If you can't answer that, it's usually a sign you shouldn't be betting at all. A good continuation bet lines up with your range advantage on the flop. Think about whether your range really is stronger than your opponent's on this board. If you raised before the flop, and the flop comes out with an ace and a couple of low cards, you probably have more strong hands in your range than the caller does. That's a spot where betting makes a lot of sense, because you're leveraging your perceived strength. On the other hand, if the board is connected and low, like 5, 4, 3, your opponent might have more strong hands than you. Betting here without a clear purpose gets you into trouble fast. Position matters too. When you're in position, you can use continuation bets to put pressure on your opponent and take control of the hand. Out of position, you're more vulnerable to raises and floats, so you've got to be even more careful about why you're betting. The purpose test helps you avoid those automatic bets that just bleed chips over time. Every time you go to bet, ask yourself, am I betting for value, for protection, or as a bluff? Is this board good for my range? Can my opponent call with worse, or do I expect them to fold better hands? If you don't have a solid answer, it's usually better to check and keep your options open. This kind of discipline keeps you from making costly mistakes, especially against sharp players who punish aimless bets. If you bet without thinking it through, you're handing your opponents chips they didn't have to work for. Betting just because you raised pre-flop, or because it feels like the standard play is how small leaks turn into big losses. The purpose test is your filter. It keeps your decisions tight and in line with your overall plan, not just the hand in front of you. Now let's talk about how the board itself shapes your continuation betting strategy. Not every flop is created equal. Some boards almost beg for a continuation bet, while others demand you slow down and pick your spots. The texture of the board, how connected or dry it is, makes a huge difference in how often you should bet and what you're trying to accomplish. On dry boards, like ace high with 2 low cards, you'll find that frequent c-betting works well. These boards don't offer many draws, and the pre-flop raiser's range looks strong. You're representing big cards, and your opponent knows it. When you bet small here, you put pressure on a wide range of hands. In these spots, you can get away with betting a high percentage of the time because your range advantage is clear. Contrast that with wet, connected boards. Think 9, 8, 7 with 2 of a suit. These flops are loaded with straight and flush possibilities. Your opponent, especially if they called from the blinds, might have all sorts of hands that connect hard with this board. Betting here without thinking can get you raised or called by a lot of hands that won't fold. That's why selective c-betting is so important on these textures. You want to bet when you actually have a strong hand or a draw yourself, or when you can credibly represent one. Otherwise, checking keeps the pot manageable and avoids tough spots on later streets. Paired boards are another place where your c-betting frequency can go up, especially in position. If the flop comes king, 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 5, your range as the pre-flop raiser looks very strong. Most opponents will struggle to have trips or a full house here. That makes it easier for you to bet, knowing your story is believable and your opponent has to be careful. On low connected flops like 5, 4, 3, you need to be careful, especially if you're out of position. These boards favor the caller's range. They might have all the sets and straights, while you're stuck with overcards and medium pairs. In these situations, your c-bet frequency should drop way down. Selective betting keeps you from getting check-raised or called down by hands that have you beat. Before you bet, always ask yourself how your range interacts with the board. If you have more strong hands than your opponent, you can bet more often. If the board is better for their range, slow down and pick your spots. This process keeps you from making lazy bets and helps you stay in control of the hand. Let's shift to sizing, because how much you bet matters as much as whether you bet at all. There are a few main sizing families for continuation bets, and your choice should always connect back to the texture of the board and your position at the table. On dry boards, small bets are standard. You'll see good players betting about 1/3 of the pot in these spots. The board isn't offering many draws, so you don't need to protect as much. A small bet still puts pressure on your opponent's weaker hands and keeps the pot manageable when you're bluffing. When the board is wet or draw heavy, you want to use a larger size. Betting 3/4 of the pot or more forces your opponent to pay if they want to chase a draw. This way, you're charging them the right price and making it expensive for them to continue with weak hands. Medium connected boards often see something in between, maybe half the pot or a bit more, depending on how many draws are possible. Out of position, most players struggle with sizing. It's easy to fall into the trap of betting too big or too small without a clear reason. The most common mistake is using an oversized bet on early position flops, especially when you're out of position. Solver studies show that around half pot is often the sweet spot here. It manages risk and keeps your range balanced. If you bet too big, you open yourself up to tough decisions when you get raised. If you bet too small, your opponent might float with all sorts of hands and make your life difficult on later streets. Stack depth and opponent tendencies also matter. If you're deep stacked, you can use larger bets to apply pressure. Against sticky opponents who call too much, you might want to size up for value. If you're up against someone who folds too much, a smaller bet might get the job done without risking more chips than necessary. No matter what, your sizing should always fit the board and your plan. If you're just picking a number because it feels right, or you saw someone else do it, you're missing the point. Thoughtful sizing makes your bets harder to read and keeps your opponents guessing. The last thing I want you to remember is that every continuation bet is a decision point. You're not just following a script. You're weighing your range, the board, your position, and your opponent's tendencies every single time. That's how you stay disciplined and process-driven. When you approach c-betting with this kind of intentionality, you'll see your mistakes shrink and your results improve, one thoughtful bet at a time. Chapter 6: Turn Play, where consistency is won. This is the street where hand strengths become clearer and ranges tighten, so players start to see where they truly stand in the hand. Many of the draws that were possible on the flop have either improved, lost value, or become much less likely. With only one more card to come, the number of possible combinations your opponent could be holding shrinks, and the true nature of each hand starts to emerge. You'll notice that the turn narrows the gap between value hands and bluffs. The flop leaves a lot of room for speculation, but the turn strips away some of that uncertainty. This means that hands which were close calls on the flop often reveal themselves as clear value bets, or easy checks on the turn. Strong hands, like sets or two pair, are now more likely to stay ahead, since there are fewer cards left that can change the outcome. At the same time, hands that were drawing on the flop may find themselves with fewer outs and less reason to keep investing chips. Medium-strength hands, such as a single pair with a weak kicker or second pair, often lose their appeal on the turn. There is less value in betting for protection, since the number of dangerous draws has dropped. Many skilled players will check these hands, aiming to reach showdown cheaply, rather than build a pot with little to gain. The turn is also the moment when disciplined players pause to reassess their plan. The new card has shifted the board texture, so it is time to reevaluate your hand's place in the range battle. Because the turn brings so much clarity, it is where strong players separate themselves by making disciplined, process-driven decisions. They are not guessing or hoping. Instead, they are calmly weighing the new information, considering how ranges have changed, and deciding whether to keep betting, check back, or even fold. If you can build this habit, you'll notice your results becoming steadier and your costly mistakes dropping off. The turn is the inflection point where consistency is either won or lost. Once you arrive at the turn, the next question is whether to keep betting or barreling into your opponent. This is where you'll want to weigh a few key criteria: your hand's equity, any blockers you hold, and the likelihood your opponent will fold. Equity is simply your share of the pot in the long run. How often your hand will win or tie at showdown against what your opponent could be holding. If you have a strong draw, like a flush or open-ended straight draw, your equity can be high enough to warrant another bet, especially if you might get folds from better hands. Blockers are another important piece. If you hold a card that your opponent needs to make the nuts, it becomes much less likely they actually have that hand. For example, if a straight is possible and you're holding one of the key cards, you know there are fewer combinations your opponent can have. This makes your bluff more credible and can tip the scales toward a profitable barrel. Blockers work the same way for flushes, full houses, or any other big hand that depends on specific cards. Fold equity is the last part of the barreling decision, and it matters more on the turn than the flop. Fold equity is the chance your opponent will give up their hand when you bet. If the board has changed in a way that makes your story believable, or if your opponent has shown signs of weakness, your fold equity goes up. Maybe the turn completed a straight or flush, and you can credibly represent that with a bet. Or maybe your opponent checked twice, suggesting they are not strong. Evaluating these cues helps you judge whether a barrel is likely to work. You also need to factor in the pot odds and your own tendencies. If your equity is just barely enough, or if you have no good blockers, it's often better to check and preserve chips. On the other hand, if you sense your opponent is likely to fold, or if your draw is strong enough to continue, a second barrel can put them under real pressure. The key is to make your decision based on the whole picture, not just one piece of the puzzle. Strong players are always reassessing as the hand develops, using every bit of new information to fine-tune their plan. Bet sizing on the turn is another area where disciplined players stand out. The size of your bet can have a big impact on how your opponent reacts. A larger bet might force out drawing hands that have just enough equity to call a small one. At the same time, a smaller bet could keep weaker hands in the pot that you want to get value from. The right size depends on the board, your opponent, and the story you are telling with your actions. Sometimes, you will find yourself in a spot where you did not bet the flop, but want to bet the turn instead. This move, called a delayed c-bet, works best when the turn card gives your hand new strength, or when your opponent has shown repeated weakness. Maybe you checked back a marginal hand on the flop, and the turn brings a card that improves your equity, or makes your opponent's range more vulnerable. In these cases, betting the turn can apply pressure and pick up pots that might have slipped away. But there are also times when the best move is to shut down your aggression. If the turn card changes the board in a way that hurts your hand or increases the risk of being behind, it is wise to check and keep the pot small. Medium-strength hands, especially, often need to slow down. If your fold equity has vanished, or your opponent is showing strength, betting again can turn a small loss into a big one. The discipline to switch gears, check back, or even fold when the situation calls for it will save you a lot of chips over time. This kind of flexibility is what separates the best players from those who are just guessing. Strong turn play is not about always betting or always checking. It is about reading the situation, adjusting your plan, and making the most profitable decision with the information you have. The more you practice this process, the more natural it will feel, and the more consistent your results will become. There is a certain calm that comes from having a process on the turn. You are not scrambling to justify a bet, or hoping your opponent will fold. You are calmly weighing your hand's equity, thinking about what blockers you hold, and reading the board and your opponent's tendencies. You are picking your bet size with a purpose, and knowing when to apply pressure or slow down. Over time, this steady approach builds confidence and protects your bankroll from the wild swings that come with guesswork. The turn is the street where good habits really pay off. Each decision you make here shapes the rest of the hand and determines whether you are building a pot with a real chance of winning or bleeding chips with hope. The goal is to be clear, disciplined, and responsive to what the game is telling you. When you can do that, you will find your consistency growing and your results following suit. This is the heart of long-term success in cash games, and it all starts with getting the turn right. Chapter 7. River Decisions with Clarity. River actions force you into a different mode of thinking than any other street. There is no more betting after this point. Whatever you decide here, you cannot take back. That finality changes how you weigh risk, reward, and the value of each chip in the pot. Every decision needs to come from a place of calm, not from pride or frustration. You want to strip away ego, set aside the urge to prove something, and just focus on making the best choice with what you know. When you are considering a river value bet, your process shifts from simply having a strong hand to targeting the right kinds of hands that your opponent will actually call with. It is not enough to think, I have trips, so I should bet. Instead, you want to pause and ask, what hands does my opponent get to the river with, and which of those are likely to call a bet from me with worse? That is value targeting. Strong players do not value bet on autopilot. They break down their opponent's previous actions, stack sizes, and tendencies to estimate the weaker hands that are still in play. Maybe the other player has shown a willingness to call down with second pair. Maybe they have not. You are always adjusting. There is a real art to building a value betting range that is neither too thin nor too narrow. If you bet too thin, you risk running into better hands that only call or raise you, and you lose value through what is called reverse domination. If you go too narrow, you miss out on extra chips you could have won from hands that would have paid you off. The best players find the sweet spot, pushing for value without stepping into traps. They size their bets to match the hands they are targeting, sometimes going small to get a crying call from a weak pair, sometimes betting big when they think the opponent will call with a wide range of worse hands. The risk on the river is overvaluing your hand. It is easy to convince yourself that your top pair is good, when in reality, the way the hand has played out means the opponent rarely calls with worse. On the flip side, You can get so cautious that you check back hands that could have earned you one more bet. The goal is to extract maximum value from the range of hands that will pay you off, while not opening yourself up to losing big pots against hands that only call or raise with better. Every river value bet comes down to this dance between optimism and caution. Bluffing on the river is a different discipline, and it is not about bravado. The best river bluffs are built on logic, not emotion. You want to choose your bluff spots when you hold cards that make it less likely your opponent has the strongest possible hands. These are called blockers. For example, if you hold a key ace or king, you know it is harder for your opponent to show up with the nut hand. That makes your bluff more credible. You are not just betting and hoping. You are using your cards to reduce the chance of a disastrous call. Bluffing successfully also means telling a believable story. Your earlier actions need to support the idea that you could legitimately have the big hand you are representing. If you have been passive all hand and then suddenly launch a huge river bluff with no history to support it, good opponents will sniff that out. They will call you down with medium strength hands, because your story does not add up. Bluffing is about building a range that makes sense from the start of the hand to the end. Every bet, check, or raise you made earlier should feed into the story you are telling now. One of the biggest dangers with river bluffs is ignoring blockers or failing to recognize when your story is not believable. If you are bluffing into a player who never folds, or if your hand actually blocks the weaker hands that would fold, you are just lighting money on fire. The same is true if your earlier play makes it obvious you cannot have the hand you are pretending to represent. Disciplined players look for the right combination of blockers and narrative before risking their chips. They understand that a good bluff is not about forcing action, but about making the opponents fold the logical choice. Now, sometimes you find yourself facing a river bet, holding a hand that is not strong enough to value bet, but might still beat some of your opponent's bluffs. This is the world of bluff catching. Here you are weighing whether your hand is good often enough to justify a call, given the size of the bet and the pot odds being offered. Pot odds are simple math. They tell you how much you need to win, as a percentage, for your call to break even. If you are calling a bet of 100 into a pot of 200, you need to win at least 1 out of 3 times for the call to be profitable. But the real skill comes in reading the opponent's range. Bluff catching is not about stubbornly calling down with anything that beats a bluff. You are asking yourself, how many value hands does my opponent have versus how many bluffs? If their line is almost always value, even a strong second best hand is a fold. The discipline to let go of hands that look strong but are not strong enough is what separates solid players from those who leak chips. It is not a sign of weakness to fold on the river. In fact, it is often a sign of strength. Good folds protect your win rate over the long run and keep you from making costly mistakes. The most advanced river players have no problem folding hands that would make most people uncomfortable. They know that if the opponent's betting range is weighted toward value, there is no reason to pay off. You will hear stories about big hero calls, but you will rarely hear about the disciplined folds that quietly save stacks over time. Remember that folding on the river does not mean you played badly. It means you trusted your process and made a clear, logical decision based on the information in front of you. All of these river decisions, value betting, bluffing, or bluff catching, are the final test of your discipline and process from earlier streets. There is no shortcut and no magic rule. Each river spot is its own puzzle, shaped by the hands you and your opponent could realistically have, the way the betting has gone, and the incentives built into the pot size and bet size. The irreversible nature of river bets means that the clarity of your reasoning matters more than anything else. You want to act with intention, not with hope or fear. When you do that, you give yourself the best chance to make profitable decisions, regardless of the outcome on any single hand. So as you approach river decisions, slow down. Take a breath. Think about what hands you are targeting, what story you are telling, and what hands you can beat. Let go of ego and let your process guide you. That is where clarity lives, and that is where your best poker will come from. Chapter 8: Pot Control and Showdown Value. Medium strength hands create a unique decision structure because their value depends on pot size and board context. When you hold a hand that is neither a clear value bet nor a clear bluff, your decisions start to revolve around the idea of showdown value. These hands do not want to build big pots, but they are too strong to fold without pressure. That is where pot control comes in, as a disciplined approach. Showdown value means you have a hand that can often win at showdown, just by checking or calling, without the need to bet for value. In most cash games, these are hands like second pair, or a medium pair on a dry board. They are not the nuts, but they are not junk either. The real trick is reading the board and your opponent's tendencies to figure out when your hand will beat their likely range if you both check it down. A hand with showdown value often sits between the hands you would bet for value and the hands you would bluff with. It is not strong enough to get called by worse hands if you bet, but it is too good to turn into a bluff. If you try to build a big pot with these hands, you usually force your opponent to play perfectly. The weaker hands fold, and the better hands stick around. That is not what you want. You also need to think about how the board texture affects your hand's value at showdown. A second pair might be strong on a dry board with no draws, but it becomes a liability if the board is coordinated, or your opponent is likely to have a lot of draws. The more possible draws or overcards, the more likely your hand will lose at showdown as the pot grows. Opponent tendencies matter just as much. If you are up against someone who calls too much, your marginal hand might not be as good for pot control. But if they fold too easily, you might be able to take a more aggressive line. Most of the time, though, when you sense that your hand is ahead of the hands your opponent would call with, but not by much, you want to avoid inflating the pot. So the real skill is in recognizing when your hand fits this middle ground. That comes from paying attention to how the hand has played out, what the board looks like, and how your opponent is likely to act. It is not always obvious, and sometimes you will be wrong, but the more you practice this, the better you will get at protecting your stack with these marginal holdings. When you are in position, you have the advantage of seeing what your opponent does before you act, especially on the turn and river. That gives you more control over the final pot size. One of the best tools for protecting your stack with medium-strength hands is the check back. By checking behind on the turn or river, you avoid putting in more chips when your hand is likely only good against weaker holdings. Checking back in position is not about giving up on the hand. It is a way to realize your equity. When you bet, you might only get called by better hands, and worse hands will fold. That means betting does not add value. By checking, you get to see the next card or showdown for free, and sometimes your opponent will try to bluff into you, giving you an easy call. For example, in many cash games, players will check back the turn with second pair in position. This keeps the pot from getting too big, and avoids the risk of facing a big raise or shove. If your opponent is aggressive, checking can even invite a bluff on the river, where you can call and pick off their weaker hands. You want to use the information you have about your opponent's tendencies and the board to decide if a thin value bet is worth it, or if checking is safer. The best times to check back are when you have a hand that could easily be beaten by a stronger holding, or when there are not many worse hands that would call a bet. If the board is dry and your opponent is likely to have missed, checking can also keep weaker hands in the pot and give your opponent a chance to make a mistake. Keeping the pot small with a check back is especially important when you are not sure where you stand. If you are out of position, you lose the advantage of acting last. That makes pot control even more important, because you can get trapped by big bets or raises from your opponent. Out of position, the challenge is that you have to act first, so you cannot see what your opponent will do before you decide. That makes it a lot easier to get into trouble with a medium-strength hand. The best way to keep the pot manageable is often to check and call instead of betting out or raising. This is called a check call line. Check calling with hands like second pair on dynamic boards allows you to see more cards without building a big pot. You keep your opponent's range wider, and you avoid putting yourself in a spot where you are only getting action from better hands. This line is especially common in cash games, where you called a 3-bet preflop and now have a hand that is good for one street, but not strong enough to go all in. Sometimes you might use a small blocking bet, out of position. This is a smaller bet that keeps the pot from growing too fast, and might even get value from weaker hands. The key is not to overdo it. If your opponent is likely to raise big, you want to avoid putting in more chips than your hand is worth. Pot control out of position works best when you are disciplined about folding, if the board gets worse for your hand or your opponent shows a lot of strength. You do not want to overcommit with a hand that is not likely to improve. By keeping the pot small, you give yourself more options and avoid the big mistakes that can happen when the pot gets too big for your holding. If your hand improves on later streets, you can shift gears and become more aggressive. But until then, the goal is to get to Showdown as cheaply as possible. That is how you protect your stack and avoid the costly mistakes that come from playing too big with marginal hands. When you focus on pot control with hands that have Showdown value, you are not playing weakly. You are making a disciplined choice to maximize your profit with hands that do not want to play for stacks. Over time, this approach preserves your win rate and prevents the slow leaks that come from overplaying medium-strength hands. By paying close attention to board texture, opponent tendencies, and your hand's relative strength, you will find more spots where pot control keeps you out of trouble and lets you collect more pots with less risk. Let the pace of the hand slow you down, and trust that a small pot won is always better than a big pot lost with a hand that was never meant to go the distance. Chapter 9: Exploitative Adjustments Against the Pool. Instead of sticking strictly to a balanced strategy that protects you from being exploited yourself, you start looking for systematic mistakes that your opponents make over and over. When you see these patterns, you can adjust your play to squeeze extra value from them. This isn't about wild guessing or charging ahead with reckless aggression. It's about careful observation, targeted adjustments, and the discipline to shift gears only when you've got enough information. Let's start by looking at the most common population leaks in cash games. Across thousands of hands in no-limit Texas Hold'em, there are certain mistakes that show up again and again. One of the biggest is poor big blind defense. A lot of players either call too wide with weak hands that can't profit over the long term, or they fold too often and let their opponents steal the pot with almost anything. Both approaches bleed equity hand after hand, and over time these small leaks add up. Another recurring leak is slow playing strong hands too much. You'll see players check top pair or better on the flop, hoping to trap, but what really happens is they miss out on value from hands that would have called a bet. It's especially costly when the board is draw heavy, and your opponent would have paid to chase. If you notice your pool is full of players who check their monsters, you can adjust by betting more for thin value and not giving away free cards. You'll also see players limping into pots pre-flop far too often. When you limp, you invite more players in, which usually means you need a stronger hand to win at Showdown. Most limpers don't adjust their standards for multi-way pots, so they end up playing too loosely and overvaluing weak hands. That's a recipe for losing chips over the long run. Another pattern you'll spot is folding to continuation bets too much on the flop. When someone bets the flop after raising pre-flop, many players just give up unless they've connected hard. If you see this happening often, you can start continuation betting more frequently, knowing you'll take down a lot of small pots uncontested. Overfolding to aggression, especially from tight players, is another leak you'll see often, particularly at the small stakes. Players get uncomfortable facing big bets and fold hands that are still ahead of an opponent's range. When this happens consistently, you can ramp up your bluffing against these players and expect to profit. The key here is to look for trends that repeat across the pool, not just isolated incidents. Not every player will show every leak, and leaks can vary by location, stake, or even time of day. The real value comes from tracking these patterns and knowing when they're present in your current game. Once you're tuned in to the leaks in the pool, you can start grouping opponents into archetypes based on how they play. This helps you target your adjustments even more precisely. Some players are passive, calling a lot, and rarely betting or raising. Others are aggressive, always looking to put pressure on and force mistakes. You'll notice some play far too many hands, while others are so tight they only enter pots with premium holdings. When you spot a passive recreational player, you can exploit their tendency to call too much by value betting thinner and avoiding big bluffs. They're unlikely to fold a decent hand, so you want to get paid when you've got the goods. Against aggressive professionals, you'll need to tighten up your calling ranges and look for spots to trap them when they overextend. Tight players as a group often overfold to big bets. If you see someone who only plays the nuts and folds to pressure, you can start bluffing more in spots where they're unlikely to call without a very strong hand. Just be careful not to overdo it if they start adjusting back. Stack size also shapes archetypes. Players with deep stacks are more likely to bluff and play a wider range of hands, especially in position. When you're up against someone with a big stack who's showing aggression, be ready for more creative lines and higher bluff frequencies. On the other hand, short-stacked players tend to tighten up and bluff less, since they can't afford to lose chips lightly. There's another group you'll see at every table, the scared money archetype. These players are worried about losing what they have, especially when the stakes feel high relative to their bankroll. They'll pass up profitable bluffs and fold hands that could be winning, just to avoid risk. When you identify this, you can attack their blinds, apply pressure in big pots, and push them off hands they'd otherwise play. It's important to remember that not every player fits neatly into a box, and you shouldn't jump to conclusions based on a small sample. Over-adjusting or stereotyping too quickly can backfire if your read is off. Stay flexible, keep watching for changes in behavior, and be ready to shift your approach as new information comes in. The environment you're playing in can also shape your exploitative opportunities. Live and online cash games each have their own rhythm and challenges. Live games run at a much slower pace, so you see fewer hands per hour. This means it takes longer to pick up on population leaks, and you need to be patient with your adjustments. Still, the average tendencies in live pools are surprisingly similar to what you'll find online, so lessons learned in one format often carry over to the other. Online, the hands come fast, and the player pool is deeper. You can use tracking software like Hold'em Manager to keep detailed stats on opponents and spot trends with much more precision than you ever could in a live setting. This lets you fine-tune your exploits and see which adjustments are paying off over time. Rake structures matter too. Online games usually take a set percentage of each pot, often capped at a certain amount. Live games might use time charges or different rake caps, and these differences can shift which exploits are profitable. For example, if the rake is high, some marginal value bets or thin bluffs might not be worth it over the long run, even if the pool's calling too wide or folding too much. Promotions, bonuses, and rewards can also tilt the balance, especially online. If there's a rake back or rewards program, you might be incentivized to play more hands or chase certain pots that you'd otherwise pass up. Every table, every venue, and every time of day can bring a new mix of tendencies and dynamics. That's why the best exploiters keep watching, keep tracking, and keep adjusting as the pool evolves. You'll find that the smartest approach is a blend of balanced fundamentals and sharp, targeted exploitation. When you spot a leak that's costing the pool real money, don't be afraid to lean in and capitalize. But always stay alert for changes, and never get complacent. Poker's a moving target, and the edge goes to the player who adapts first and adapts best. Chapter 10. The most common cash game leaks. Your cash game decisions always flow from the habits you bring to the table, and the most common leaks in these games quietly shape that decision structure in ways you might not notice right away. Seeing these patterns for what they are is not about blame. It is about giving yourself the clearest map to improvement. Most leaks fall into three broad areas: preflop and positional mistakes, postflop aggression and sizing errors, and emotional or session-based pitfalls. Each of these can chip away at your results over time, sometimes without any dramatic blow-up, just a steady leak that adds up across hundreds or thousands of hands. Preflop choices set the tone for the entire hand, and ignoring position here can spiral into trouble later. The most common leak is playing too many hands from early positions, especially in no-limit Texas Hold'em cash games. When you open too wide from seats like under the gun or early middle, you are forcing yourself to play out of position with hands that will not hold up well after the flop. These marginal hands look tempting on their own, but they rarely realize their equity when you are first to act and facing multiple opponents. Over time, the cost of these extra hands is much higher than it seems in the moment. Position matters even more when you think about how your ranges should adjust from seat to seat. Many players use the same starting hand selection no matter where they sit, but in practice, your opening range should be tightest in early position and gradually widen the closer you get to the button. Playing too passively from late position is also a frequent leak. If you are not raising enough on the button or cutoff, you are missing out on the opportunity to pressure the blinds and pick up pots uncontested. On the other hand, some players try to steal too frequently from late position, especially against opponents who defend aggressively. When you push this too far, your win rate from these seats can actually turn negative over time. Another pre-flop leak comes from calling too often instead of raising or 3-betting. Flat calling may seem like a way to see cheap flops, but in most cash games, it leads to losing situations across many hands. By calling instead of raising, you give up initiative and often end up in multi-way pots with hands that are hard to play post-flop. Being disciplined enough to fold marginal suited or connected hands in the wrong spots is not easy, but it is crucial for long-term profit. Overvaluing these hands, especially out of position, tends to set up difficult post-flop choices and can slowly drain your stack. Defending the big blind is another spot where leaks show up frequently. If you call too loosely or fold too often, you are either bleeding chips or giving up too much equity. The key is to defend with hands that play well post-flop and to adjust based on the raiser's tendencies and your own stack depth. Small leaks here add up across the hundreds of times you are in the big blind, so tightening up this part of your game often brings quick results. Once the flop comes down, aggression and sizing become the main battlegrounds for value. One of the biggest post-flop leaks is betting too small with value hands. When you have a strong made hand, betting too little lets opponents see more cards for cheap, allowing them to realize their equity and sometimes outdraw you. On the flip side, failing to apply pressure with draws, like open-ended straight draws or flush draws, means you are not maximizing fold equity or building the pot when you do hit. For example, with an open-ended straight draw, you will only complete your straight on the turn about 17% of the time, so you cannot rely on hitting your hand. Purposeful aggression helps you win pots, both when you hit and when your opponent folds. Improper sizing is not just about missing value, it also makes your ranges too transparent. If you bet large only with strong hands and small with weak ones, observant players catch on quickly. Tailoring your bet size to the situation, considering board texture, opponent type, and stack sizes, keeps your play balanced and harder to exploit. Betting too small in multi-way pots is another common leak. In these spots, you need to protect your equity by making it expensive for opponents to chase draws or call with marginal hands. Passivity is another post-flop leak that creeps in when players check too often in situations where betting is typically better. This often happens after missing the flop, but checking behind with hands that still have decent equity or fold potential means you lose out on building the pot or forcing mistakes. Conversely, slow playing strong hands too regularly leads to missed value. The probability of flopping a set with a pocket pair is about 12%, so when you finally get there, you want to build the pot, not let it check around and miss out on bets. Calling down too often is a subtle but expensive leak, especially on the river. In most no-limit Texas Hold'em cash games, bluffs are rare on the river, so calling every time you face a sizable bet will cost you over the long run. Similarly, calling bets on all three streets post-flop is usually a losing proposition, as you are often up against stronger ranges by the river. Folding too frequently to continuation bets is the opposite problem, giving up pots that could be yours with a bit of resistance. Striking the right balance between aggression and caution is what separates winning players from those who tread water. As the session wears on, emotional and session-based leaks start to show themselves. Tilt, anger, and the urge for revenge can push you far outside your best decision-making. When you are upset, you tend to play too many hands, chase losses, or make impulsive bluffs. Fatigue is just as dangerous. Playing too late into the night, especially when you are exhausted, leads to mistakes you would never make when fresh. This lack of discipline often turns a winning session into a losing one, or digs an even deeper hole when things are already not going your way. Bankroll management is another area where leaks can have devastating consequences. Not setting aside enough buy-ins for the stakes you play, or moving up too quickly after a good run, can both lead to going broke, even if your technical skills are strong. Poor game selection is a quieter leak, but just as important. Sitting in games with tough lineups or unfavorable conditions consistently reduces your win rate, no matter how well you play. You want to be deliberate about choosing spots where you have an edge, rather than trying to prove something in every lineup. The best way to catch these leaks is to build habits of self-diagnosis. After each session, ask yourself where you felt uncomfortable or lost control. Did you play too many hands out of position? Did you call down light on the river, or let tilt creep into your decisions after a tough beat? Keeping notes and reviewing hands where you are unsure can reveal patterns you might not notice in the heat of the moment. Setting stop-loss limits or taking regular breaks helps keep emotional swings from turning into larger problems. Leak correction is not a one-time project. The game keeps evolving, and new habits can slip in without you noticing. Regular study, honest self-review, and a willingness to adjust are what keep you ahead. The goal is never to play perfectly, but to stay aware and keep the leaks small. Each step you take to spot and patch these leaks makes your decisions sharper and your results steadier over the long term. The discipline to keep checking for leaks is what sets consistent winners apart in the world of cash games. Chapter 11: Mental Game and Session Process. When you treat poker as a process, not a series of outcomes, your choices start to line up with your long-term goals instead of short-term feelings. That shift in focus is what separates consistent players from those who ride the emotional waves of every session. Getting yourself into the right mindset before you play really sets the tone for how you handle the ups and downs that come with cash games. Most players who take their routines seriously start with a simple warm-up. The idea is to move your attention away from whatever else is happening in your life and into a state where you can make the best decisions possible. You might start by taking a couple of minutes to review your session goals. Maybe you're working on specific spots, like defending your big blind more selectively, or focusing on bet sizing in multi-way pots. Whatever it is, the act of naming a clear intention helps anchor your attention. When you know what you want to focus on, it's easier to catch yourself if you start drifting into autopilot. A lot of players also do a quick mental check-in before they play. It can be as simple as asking yourself if you're tired, stressed, or distracted. This little self-assessment can spare you from playing when you are not at your best. If you notice you're not feeling sharp, it might be worth delaying your session or taking a few minutes to reset. Some people like to listen to music or do a short meditation to get into a neutral mental space. Even just a few deep breaths can help lower tension and signal to your brain that it's time to focus. Hydration is something that gets overlooked, but it makes a difference. Drinking water before you start supports your brain function and keeps you alert through those long hands. It is not about chasing perfection, just about building a habit that supports your attention. Some players like to review a few hands or notes from recent study sessions right before they start playing. This refreshes your memory on key concepts and reminds you of adjustments you want to make. It is not about cramming information, but about keeping your learning active as you head into real decisions. When you combine these elements into a short, repeatable routine, you are really just giving yourself a chance to transition smoothly from daily life to poker. Over time, this habit helps you play more sessions at your best. You are less likely to fall into impulsive decisions or get swept up by emotion because you have already anchored your focus on what matters. During play, your ability to stay aware of your emotional state can make or break your session. Tilt is what happens when your feelings start taking over your decision-making. It is not just about getting angry. Sometimes it shows up as impatience, frustration, or even zoning out and playing passively. The real danger is that tilt often sneaks up on you. You might not realize you are making worse decisions until you have already lost a couple of buy-ins. One of the best ways to get ahead of tilt is by tracking your emotional state as you play. You do not need anything fancy. Just take a few seconds every so often to check in with yourself. Are you feeling frustrated after a tough hand? Are you starting to rush your decisions? Noticing these shifts is the first step to interrupting them. A lot of players find that early bad beats or losing a big pot right out of the gate can trigger a tilt spiral. That is when you start chasing losses or making big bluffs just to get even. Sometimes the tilt does not look like aggression. It can mean you start folding too much, or stop taking profitable spots, because you are afraid of getting hurt again. Both patterns come from the same place. Your emotions start guiding your play instead of your strategy. Keeping a lookout for your own tilt triggers is a practical skill. Maybe you know that losing to a 2-outer rattles you. Or maybe you notice that playing when you are already stressed from work makes everything feel worse. Recognizing those patterns ahead of time makes it easier to catch yourself in the moment. Some players use a mental cue, like reminding themselves to slow down and take a breath before each decision. Others have a rule to stand up and stretch if they notice their focus slipping. It is also common to bring emotional baggage from outside the game right into your session. If you are already carrying stress or frustration, even small setbacks at the table can feel much bigger. Being honest about your mental state and giving yourself permission to pause or adjust helps keep things from spiraling. Another tilt pattern shows up when you have not warmed up properly. Maybe you sit down and play a few hands passively before you realize the table is much more aggressive than you expected. That slow start can lead to frustration and bad decisions if you are not paying attention. By making in-session check-ins a habit, you give yourself more chances to reset before things get out of hand. Finishing a session with a deliberate cooldown helps you separate poker from the rest of your life. When you end play without a transition, it is easy to carry the emotions of the session with you for hours or even days. A calm ending gives your mind a chance to process what happened and prepares you for future improvement. A typical cooldown might start with a few minutes of quiet reflection. You can look back at a couple of key hands, not to judge yourself, but to notice where your decisions lined up with your intentions and where they drifted. The goal is not to punish yourself for mistakes, but to spot patterns you want to address next time. Some players like to note their emotional responses after the session. Maybe you felt anxious after a big loss, or proud of a tough fold. Writing these feelings down even briefly helps you recognize how emotions show up in your play. It also makes it easier to spot trends over time. Recording your session results is important, but it works best when you do it without judgment. The number at the end of the day does not define you as a player. It is just one data point in a much longer journey. By treating results as information, not identity, you keep your focus on the process rather than the outcome. Mindfulness practices, like a few slow breaths or a short walk, can help you let go of any lingering tension. The idea is to move your mind out of high-performance mode and back into your regular life. This kind of transition is what keeps poker from bleeding into your mood or relationships outside the game. When you make cooldowns part of your routine, you train yourself to handle both the highs and lows of poker with the same steady mindset. Over time, this habit helps you recover faster from tough sessions and approach each new game with a clear head. Building a solid mental game is not about chasing motivation or trying to force yourself to feel a certain way. It is about creating routines that support your decision quality, no matter what the cards or the results bring. When you treat professionalism as a matter of daily habits, warm-ups to set your focus, check-ins to catch tilt, cooldowns to reset, you give yourself the best chance to grow and thrive in the long run. You are not just playing hands. You are building the kind of discipline that lasts through thousands of sessions, win or lose. That steadiness is what lets you keep improving, year after year, no matter what happens at the table. Chapter 12. A Sustainable Study System. Every decision you make at the table changes when you commit to a steady loop of play, review, and application. This kind of structure keeps your improvement moving forward at a pace you can actually keep up with, rather than burning out or getting lost in theory. When your week is set up around this cycle, you always know what you are working on and why. Let's look at how a typical week might feel if you want to keep your study sustainable. On the first day, you pick one main area to focus on. For example, you might decide to work on 3-betting from the small blind in no-limit Texas Hold'em cash games. That becomes your theme. You do not need to know everything about it right away. You just set an intention for the next few days. When you sit down to play, you are not trying to fix your whole game at once. You are just paying extra attention to those small blind 3-bet spots, looking for places to try new lines or sharpen your awareness. As the week goes on, you keep your play sessions as normal as possible, but you make a point to log a few notes after each one. Maybe you jot down a quick thought about a hand that confused you, or a spot where you hesitated. This does not have to be fancy or long. Just a couple of lines to remind yourself what stood out. These little notes are gold when you look back later. By the middle of the week, you have a handful of sessions behind you and a few situations that keep coming up. Maybe you notice you are folding too much in certain spots, or you keep getting called when you bluff. The important thing is that you are not trying to overhaul everything. You are just gathering information, seeing how your focus area plays out in real time. When the week wraps up, you take 10 or 15 minutes to reflect. You do not need to review every hand or analyze every session. Just look at your notes and think about whether you actually stayed focused on your topic. Did you try out the new ideas you set out to test? Did you notice any patterns or surprises? This end-of-week checkpoint is a chance to see what worked, what felt off, and what you might want to tweak for next week. Journaling here is helpful. You can write down any new insights, big questions that popped up, or ideas for what to study next. Sometimes you will realize your chosen topic is still confusing and needs another week. Other times, you will feel ready to pick a new focus. The key is that this loop never really ends. Each week you are building a routine that can last, not a sprint that wears you out. Most people feel overwhelmed when they think about reviewing every hand they play. That is not only unnecessary, it can actually slow down your learning. The best way to review is to be selective and intentional. You want to focus on the hands that really matter for your development. After each session, look for hands that felt tough in the moment. These might be spots where you were not sure what to do, or where your decision did not sit right after the hand was over. Maybe you felt a surge of emotion in a big pot, or you lost more than expected in a situation you thought was straightforward. These are clues that the hand is worth a closer look. You do not need to review more than a few hands per day. In fact, just a handful of well-chosen hands will teach you more than dozens of routine spots. Over time, you will notice certain themes repeating. Maybe you are consistently unsure about playing draws out of position, or you keep running into trouble with thin value bets on the river. These recurring issues are your personal roadmap for growth. When you pick hands to review, also think about how they relate to your weekly focus. If you spent the week working on small blind 3-bets, look for hands where you made that play and something unexpected happened. Was your plan clear? Did you stick to your intention, or did you fall back on old habits? These hands are the bridge between your study and your actual play. Hands involving unfamiliar post-flop situations are especially valuable. If you keep running into boards you are not comfortable with, or you are unsure about bet sizing in certain spots, flag those hands. Over several weeks, you will build a library of situations that challenge you most, and your review time becomes even more targeted. Some players find it useful to track their confidence levels in different spots. If you notice you are second-guessing yourself in certain types of hands, those are prime candidates for review. The idea is not to fix everything at once, but to gradually close the gaps where uncertainty or leaks keep showing up. Study tools can feel overwhelming if you approach them as sources of answers to memorize. The real value comes from using these tools to uncover principles and patterns that explain why certain plays work better than others. When you use a solver, resist the urge to just copy down the recommended ranges. Instead, use it to test your own ideas. For example, you can run a simulation on a common spot, like a button open versus big blind call, and see how the solver's preferred actions shift when you change the board or stack sizes. Watch how frequencies and bet sizes adapt as the situation changes. Try to focus on the bigger picture. Ask yourself why the solver prefers certain actions in one position, but not another. Notice how positional dynamics and bet sizing interact. These patterns are much more valuable than memorizing outputs for isolated hands. Software tools are also good for visualizing how strategies evolve across streets. You can see how a solver's recommended frequencies change from preflop to river, and where it starts to make exploitative adjustments. This helps you develop a sense for how to adapt your play in live games, where opponents are not always following theory perfectly. Over time, you will build a mental library of principles that apply across many hands. You will start to recognize when a spot fits a pattern you have seen before, and you will have the flexibility to adjust instead of relying on rote memory. This makes your game more resilient and adaptive at the table. The goal is always to deepen your understanding, not to chase perfection. If you spend a few minutes each week exploring a new scenario or principle with your study tools, you will find these ideas show up naturally in your play. The process is not about getting every answer right on the first try. It is about seeing the game a little more clearly, week by week. When you keep your study system light, steady, and focused, it becomes something you can sustain for the long haul. The improvements may feel small from one week to the next, but over time they add up in a way that feels natural and satisfying. You are not chasing shortcuts or overwhelming yourself. You are building something that will last as long as you want to keep playing. Chapter 13. A practical hand-reading workflow. Every betting round in poker changes what you know about an opponent's possible hands, and that shifts the structure of your decisions in real time. When you start a hand, you work with the widest range you can justify based on position, the action so far, and what you know about that player's tendencies. As the hand moves forward, each bet, check, or raise helps you eliminate some hands and focus on others. This narrowing of possible holdings is a process, not a single leap. You do it bit by bit, one street at a time, and it rarely leads to absolute certainty. Let's think about how this works from the start. Before the flop, you look at where the other player is sitting and what they did with their chips. Someone raising from early position usually has a tighter, stronger set of hands than someone who just called from the button. You might not know exactly what cards they hold, but you can make a reasonable list of what's likely in their range. That list is your starting point, and you'll keep refining it as new cards and actions appear. Once the flop hits, you get another round of clues. If your opponent bets right away, some hands that made sense before the flop may not fit anymore. For example, if they raised pre-flop and now check a low dry flop, you can probably remove some strong hands that would want to keep betting for value. Or, if they bet big into multiple players, that usually means they're representing strength, so you might cut out the weaker hands from their pre-flop range. The key is not to make wild guesses, but to look for hands that just do not make sense given the action. The turn brings more information and a chance to refine your opponent's range even further. Now you can look at the whole story so far. If the player has taken a line that's consistent with a strong hand, but then checks the turn on a dangerous card, you might need to reconsider whether their earlier bets were really for value or just for protection. Bet sizing starts to matter more too. A small bet after a big one can sometimes show weakness, while a big turn bet might signal the top of their range or a strong draw. You'll never get perfect clarity, but each decision can help you remove hands that just do not add up with the full sequence of actions. When the river comes, you have nearly all the information you're going to get. Now is when you try to narrow things down as tightly as possible before making your final decision. By this point, you've already tossed out hands that do not fit the story. You are left with a handful of likely holdings, and you weigh your options against that set. Sometimes the river action will surprise you, and you'll need to adjust quickly. Other times, it will just confirm what you already suspected. All this narrowing is incremental. You rarely get to eliminate every possibility. Instead, you just keep shaving away the least likely hands and focusing on what remains. Even something that happens as rarely as flopping a set, about one time in 8.5 with a pocket pair, needs to be considered, but you do not want to overrate the unlikely. The value of this stepwise process is that it keeps you honest and disciplined. You are always working with the best information available, not jumping to conclusions or trying to guess the exact cards. It's important to remember that hand reading is never about certainty. You are not trying to name a single hand and bet your whole decision on it. Instead, you are building a set of possibilities and deciding which ones are most likely. This is all about probability, estimating what makes sense given the evidence, not declaring something as fact. Every opponent has a range, and within that range, some hands are more likely than others because of the actions they took and the board that developed. When you start out, you want to keep your assigned range pretty broad. If you do not know much about an opponent, it's safer to assume they could have a wide set of hands. As you get more data, like how they play certain positions or respond to pressure, you can start to narrow that range more confidently. But even then, you do not want to assume every hand is equally likely. Some combinations fit their story much better than others. Let's say you see a player who loves to raise preflop, but rarely follows through with big bets on the flop, unless they connect hard. When they suddenly bet big on a scary board, you should weigh the strong hands more heavily in their range. Or maybe you have someone who always calls with draws but folds weak pairs. When they stick around on a dangerous turn card, you might assign more likelihood to flush or straight draws than to top pair. The language you use in your own head matters here. Try to think in terms like often, sometimes, or rarely, when you are weighing a hand's likelihood. For example, you might say to yourself, he often has top pair here, sometimes has a draw, and rarely has a complete bluff. That kind of thinking keeps you open to possibilities, without getting locked into one answer. The more you practice this, the easier it gets to spot when something is off, or when the story is lining up just as expected. There's always some uncertainty, and the best players are comfortable with that. They do not need to know exactly what their opponents hold. They just need to know what makes sense most of the time, and play accordingly. When you start to assign likelihoods instead of certainties, you free yourself from the pressure of being perfect. Decisions become about managing risk and reward, not solving a mystery down to the last card. To keep things simple and avoid overwhelm, it helps to ask yourself one clear question at every major decision point. This keeps your thought process organized and stops you from getting lost in details that do not matter. Each street gives you a new opportunity to focus your mind. Pre-flop, the question is usually, what hands would this player take this action with, from this position? That means you look at their seat, their bet size, and anything you know about their usual style. Are they the type to raise light from late position, or do they only show up with big hands? This first question frames everything else you are about to do. Once you see the flop, you want to ask, which hands from that pre-flop range continue with this action? If they check, maybe they missed. If they bet, which hands make sense to do that? You do not need to answer perfectly, just get a sense for what fits and what does not. On the turn, you refine again by asking, does their action now still fit with the story so far? Maybe the board changed, or the bet sizing got strange. You are looking for consistency, and you are making sure you have not missed something important. When the river arrives, your final question is, given everything up to now, what is the most likely set of hands left? This is where you put it all together and decide how to act. You do not need to be certain. You just need to be clear about what you are facing and what the risk and reward look like. Keeping it to one question per street keeps your mind calm and your analysis sharp. You are not trying to do everything at once. You are just moving step by step, using the information you have, and letting each answer guide the next decision. Even something as rare as hitting a gut shot straight draw on the next card, about 8.5%, can be factored in without letting it distract you from the main question. Over time, this process becomes a habit. You start to trust your ability to break down ranges, assign likelihoods, and ask the right questions. You stop worrying about being perfect and start focusing on making the best decision you can with what you know. That's how you build a steady, sustainable hand-reading process that supports long-term improvement. When you approach every hand with this kind of clarity and discipline, you will find your decisions feel less rushed and more grounded. The uncertainty never goes away, but it becomes something you manage, rather than something that manages you. That's where real progress starts to show up, both in your results and in your confidence at the table. Chapter 14: A Repeatable Decision Checklist. Every poker decision at the table becomes clearer when you anchor your process around a repeatable checklist. Using a calm, stepwise approach changes how you navigate choices, especially when pressure or uncertainty creeps in. This checklist is about building mental habits that keep you grounded and consistent, no matter what stakes you are playing or who is across from you. Let's start with the very first moments of any hand. Before the cards are even dealt, you can prepare by running through a set of pre-flop anchors. These are simple cues that keep you from drifting into autopilot or letting nerves rush your judgment. The first anchor is position. In No Limit Texas Hold'em, your seat at the table shapes which hands you should play and how you should play them. When you are under the gun, you will want to stick to much tighter starting hands than when you are on the button. This one adjustment alone can prevent a lot of trouble later in the hand. Your next anchor is identifying the location of weaker players. During the first 10 hands, you can often spot who is playing too many pots, calling too wide, or making sizing mistakes. If you see a weaker player to your right, you might decide to play more hands in position against them. If they are on your left, you may tighten up, since you will be out of position more often. This quick scan shapes your pre-flop plan before you even look at your cards. Stack depth and pot odds are another early checkpoint. Take a moment to see how deep the effective stacks are compared to the blinds. The stack-to-pot ratio, or SPR, tells you how much leverage you and your opponents have to apply pressure in later streets. With short stacks, you might choose hands that play well all in. With deep stacks, you will want hands that can make strong value hands after the flop. Pot odds come into play with every pre-flop raise and call. If the price is good and the stacks are deep, some speculative hands become more appealing, Now, before you act, pause to review opponent tendencies. Does the player raising tend to be aggressive, or do they only play premium hands? Are there players who call too often or fold too easily? These tendencies inform whether you should raise, call, or fold, and can help you size your bets to exploit their habits. Running through these anchors, position, player location, stack depth, pot odds, and tendencies, gives you a structured start to every hand. You do not need to rush. Even under time pressure, a quick mental scan of these factors will prevent many impulsive mistakes. Once the pre-flop action settles and you see the flop, the next part of your checklist comes into play. Here, you will want to slow down and check a few key points before making your move. The first checkpoint is the board texture. Is the flop dry, with disconnected cards and few draws? Or is it coordinated, with straight and flush possibilities? On dry flops, continuation betting works well because most opponents have missed. On wet boards, you will want to be more careful, since more draws and made hands are out there. Next, compare your hand to the likely ranges your opponents could have. Think about what hands make sense for them to have gotten to this point. Are they likely to have hit top pair, or are they drawing? How does your hand stack up against those possibilities? This step is not about knowing exactly what they have, but about weighing which hands are most likely. Pot odds and equity are your next planning checkpoint. If you have a flush draw on the flop, you know you have about a 1 in 5 chance to hit on the next card. Stack to pot ratio matters here too. If the pot is large compared to the remaining stacks, you may be forced to commit with draws or medium strength hands. If there is room to maneuver, you can play more cautiously or get value from strong hands. Pause again to consider your position. Acting last gives you more information and allows you to control the size of the pot. Being out of position often means you have to be more selective with your aggression. Table dynamics also matter. If the table is playing loose and aggressive, you may want to tighten up. If everyone is passive, you can push more often with a wider range. Let's put these checkpoints into action. Imagine you are in a hand with a flush draw after the flop. You know your odds of hitting on the turn are about 19%. The pot is growing, and your opponent bets. Before you call or raise, run through your checklist. Is the board safe or dangerous? Are you in position or out of position? What does your opponent's range look like? And do you have the right pot odds to continue? These quick checks help you avoid overcommitting with weak draws or missing value with strong-made hands. They also keep you from making snap decisions that do not fit the situation. As the hand reaches the river, the final stage of your checklist comes into focus. This is where clarity matters most, and the cost of mistakes is highest. Start by reviewing how the hand has played out. Think back through the pre-flop action, the bets on the flop and turn, and how the board developed. Do your opponent's actions make sense for the hands you think they could have? Are they representing a strong hand, or could they be bluffing? Next, recalculate ranges. What hands are left that make sense for each player to have? Sometimes, a line that seemed believable on earlier streets no longer fits the river action. If your opponent suddenly bets big on the river after playing passively, pause and ask if their story adds up. This step alone can help you avoid calling with weak hands or making thin value bets that are unlikely to get called by worse. Double-check pot odds before you commit chips. If you are considering a call, make sure the amount you have to call is justified by the size of the pot and the likelihood your hand is good. If you are thinking about betting for value, ask yourself what hands will actually call you and whether they are worse than yours. This is also the moment to pause and check your emotions. Are you acting out of frustration, fear, or hope? The river is where discipline matters most. A final brief pause to make sure your decision fits the process, not your feelings, can save you from some of the most expensive errors in poker. Practicing this checklist over and over is what makes it automatic. You will not always have the luxury of a long pause at the table, especially when the action is fast. But the more you run through these steps in your head, the more natural they become. Over time, this process will feel like second nature. You will notice fewer rushed mistakes and more clarity under pressure. The real value of this checklist is not in the results of any one hand, but in the steady, disciplined decisions it encourages every time you sit down to play. Let yourself settle into the rhythm of these steps. Start each hand with a calm preflop scan. Work through your planning checkpoints on the flop and turn. Approach the river with a clear head and a careful review. With practice, you will find yourself making better decisions more consistently, and the pressure of the moment will feel a little lighter each time. Chapter 15: Closing and Next Steps. When you start approaching each poker session with a clear decision process, the way you think about hands shifts. You stop reacting to luck or swings and start focusing on whether your choices match your plan. This mindset is what leads to steady growth, but it takes some practice to make it automatic. Most players find that the fastest way to build this habit is to run a short experiment, a 1-week consistency challenge. For 1 week, try to play every session with the goal of sticking to your decision checklist. That means before every action, you pause and walk through your steps, no matter how routine the hand looks. This is not about how many hands you win or lose. The point is to see how often you actually follow your own process, when the cards are in the air. To get the most out of this, set up a simple tracking method. You could use a notebook, a spreadsheet, or even notes on your phone. After each session, jot down whether you followed your checklist, every hand, most hands, or if you slipped at any point. Try to add a line or two about what made it easy or hard to stick to your plan. Maybe you notice that you rush decisions when you are tired, or that you forget a step when facing a big river bet. At the end of the week, look back over your notes. You will probably spot some patterns, times when discipline held up under pressure, or moments where you drifted into autopilot. The goal is not to be perfect. No one is, especially early on. What matters is that you are honest about your process, and that you see even small signs of improvement. Often you will notice that consistency itself makes tough decisions feel less stressful and boosts your confidence, even if the cards do not always cooperate. That feeling is what you are aiming for in the long run. Once you have a few sessions recorded, you will have enough data to start building a personal leak list. Every player has leaks, those recurring mistakes that cost money over time. The most useful way to find yours is by reviewing recent hands or sessions and noting spots where you did not follow your intended plan. Maybe you called too loose before the flop, or chased a draw when you knew you should fold. Sometimes it is about technical errors, like misreading a board or missing a value bet. Other times it is more about emotion, playing a hand out of frustration, or ignoring your own rules after a bad beat. As you go through your notes, write down each leak as clearly as you can. Try to separate them into types. A technical leak might be something like playing too many weak hands from early position. An emotional leak could be tilting after losing a big pot. Sometimes you will spot process leaks, like skipping your checklist when action gets fast. Labeling leaks this way helps you see where your weaknesses really come from. It is tempting to try and fix everything at once, but that almost never works. Pick one or maybe two leaks that show up most often, and make those your focus for the next stretch of play. Set a simple, specific goal for each one. For example, you might decide to fold all hands below a certain strength in early position for the next 50 hands, or to take a short break every time you lose a big pot to reset emotionally. Keep your leak list handy and update it as you make progress. If you notice a leak showing up less often, that is a clear sign you are improving. If a new one pops up, add it to the list, but do not let it overwhelm you. The goal is to build a habit of honest review and steady correction, not to become flawless overnight. Most experienced players keep their leak list for months or even years, crossing off old leaks and adding new ones as their game evolves. As you work through your own process, you will probably find some situations or formats that feel especially tricky or confusing. Maybe you are not sure how to handle certain spots in 6-max games, or you wonder about bankroll management at a new stake. That is a good time to reach out and suggest topics or scenarios you want to see explored more deeply. When you share your experiences or questions, it helps shape future learning for everyone. Some players want a deep dive into the differences between full ring and 6-max cash games, especially since game speed and player pool sizes can really change the feel of each format. Others are curious about how to adjust when moving up stakes, or how to handle the unique rhythms of online versus live play. There is no one-size-fits-all answer, so your feedback helps make sure the next steps match what real players face at the tables. If you have a particular spot or concept that always leaves you second-guessing, write it down. Maybe it is a tough decision in a common spot, or something that only comes up once in a while, but always throws you off. Even if it feels niche or specific, chances are good that other players have run into the same thing. Sharing these details makes it easier to build content that actually fits your needs and helps you move forward. Remember, the process of getting better at poker is not about quick fixes or chasing hot streaks. The real progress comes from doing the work, session by session, and being honest with yourself about where you stand. If you keep showing up, tracking your decisions, and making small adjustments, the results will follow at their own pace. Take a moment to think about your own next steps. Maybe you are ready to try a consistency challenge, or maybe you want to put together your first leak list. Perhaps you have a format or stake you want explored in more detail. Wherever you are, there is room to experiment and grow. You get to decide how your poker journey unfolds, and you can always adjust your approach as you learn more about yourself and the game. As you move forward, keep the focus on the process, not the outcome. Every hand you play with intention adds to your experience. Every note you take brings you a little closer to the player you want to become. When you are ready, share your questions, your challenges, or your suggestions for what comes next. That conversation is where the best learning happens, and you are always invited to be part of it.